So other things we talked about changing, or other realities of the southern colonies we talked about, was the role and absence of women. What do you remember reading or discussing in lectures about life in the South for women?
They had more rights than
Women do develop more rights. Why?
there weren't.
What was likely to happen to a woman who came to the southern colonies? Most likely her husband would die, right? She would be widowed several times, which means she'd take her husband's estate and she would become the proprietor of her husband's estate. And at first, women, when they would marry again, would lose their property. Well, these women were smart, as women are. And so they would refuse to marry again because they would lose their dead husband's estate until the law changes and basically says that estate stays with the woman. So people like George Washington made themselves rich by marrying widows like Martha Custis. That's really what pushes Washington into this elite tier of Southern planters. So women were growing more property rights in the South, but also they were few in number, right? They were few in number because originally those indentured servants came over by themselves. They were few in number because it was incredibly dangerous to be in the South. And they were few in number because childbirth was very, very difficult in the South because of the number of diseases. I was trying to explain earlier today about how waterborne diseases could really wreak havoc on a population that doesn't have antibiotics. You know, a woman is pregnant, she's going to lose blood, she's going to have injury, people are going to be messing with her, she's going to get an infection, and a lot of times, because of that, the amount of bacteria and parasites and stuff, that would cause a woman to die within a week or so after childbirth. Very dangerous game to play. Another thing we talked about was religion. Tell me what the religious climate was in the South. How did Southerners feel about religion? Yeah, Nick.
So they didn't really practice it as much as the people in the North who were like really religious. They still like believed in it, but they wouldn't like, what's the word? They wouldn't really like.
They weren't as passionate.
Passionate, yeah.
Yeah, they were more secular. They were more live and let live. The Anglican Church was the established church of the Southern colonies, except Maryland, tolerates Catholics. But most Southerners were not very serious about their religious responsibilities. Or if they were, the government didn't get entangled in that. It was pretty standard status quo. Yeah, and that's a big difference too. So with the end of this lecture, I will kind of wrap up a compare and contrast of the North and the South. And that's going to be important because if you get an essay question from this time period, almost always it's going to be some kind of comparison between the regions of the colonies, North versus South, or North, Middle, and South. So we have to be aware of that. New England provides a lot of contrast to the Southern colonies. We talked about that the Puritans initially wanted to be in Virginia, right? They wanted to start the Plymouth plantation in Virginia. They get lost and they wash up on the rocky shores of Massachusetts. And Massachusetts is certainly not the temperate climate of the South. They're going to have harsh winters. They're going to have hot summers. They've got all four seasons going on, and the soil is pretty rocky, okay? This means plantation agriculture is not going to be successful in most of New England. Without plantation agriculture, it's going to force the New England settlers into having a more diverse economy, okay? You know that they're going to be shipbuilders. They're going to be merchants that basically transport goods with ships as opposed to growing cash crops. Cities in New England start to develop artisans. If you don't know what an artisan is, It's somebody that has a craft, a specific craft. We like artisan stuff in our own time. You go down to like the Haymarket in Lincoln, or you go to what's the place downtown Omaha? The Old Market, right? You go into a store and they specialize in soap, or they specialize in records, or selling drug paraphernalia. Those are artisans. They're focusing on a craft, right? Those kinds of small shop owners are developing in northern cities in a way that they didn't in the South. And then everybody is farming, but the type of farming they do is subsistence farming. Why am I telling you this? Because with a diverse economy, that region of the country, that region of the continent is not going to be harmed as severely when market prices go up and down in one particular field. The price of tobacco could either make plantation owners incredibly successful, or if the tobacco market crashes, it could lead to a depression in that region. New England is going to weather the market way better than the South. And it's going to lead, eventually when we get to the Civil War, it's going to lead the South to be a little envious, a little jealous of the North. Because when they struggle, the North seems to keep on going, okay? Now, one of the students in a previous class was frustrated because they're like, Mr. Hofer, you're jumping all over timelines here. Well, we have to be able to recognize connections across time, which is why every once in a while I go, hey, let's talk about today. Let's talk about the Civil War. Oh, let's go backwards and make these connections based on themes. New England has a very diverse climate and a very diverse economy. Okay? One of the things that's going to change the lifestyle of New England in the middle of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th centuries is immigration. Okay? Immigration is going to change how hardcore Puritans are about their theocracy. What is theocracy? Right, combination of religion and government. Okay? Today we would not say what the Pilgrims had was democratic, but it was way more democratic than what they had in the South. All right, in the South, the plantation owners controlled 98% of everything. And so the mass majority of white farmers who didn't have enough property to be citizens, they were out of luck. They didn't get to participate in the House of Burgesses. But in the North, membership to the church meant that larger numbers of white men could participate in government. That seems pretty good. But as we get into the 18th century, the 1700s, immigration from other places, from the Netherlands, okay, from Sweden, from other parts of the colonies, puts pressure on the Puritan elite to change their culture, okay? And there's another group that starts to change the culture of New England as well, and that's native-born citizens. Unlike the South, New England had a growing family environment. Remember, the Pilgrims brought their wives with them on the Mayflower. They had children. In fact, they were so successful at having children that they start to reproduce and grow as a colony by natural reproduction. Who is in AP Geography? You've talked all about population rates, haven't you? Where natural reproduction is part of your growth rate, immigration is part of your growth rate. New England is growing because families there are successful. And in a minute, I'll talk about the role of women, but it also should tell us a little bit about the health of people in New England versus the South. But all of these new people are not as hardcore about religion as the old Puritans were, people like John Winthrop and William Bradford. They're going to start to put pressure on the leaders of the Pilgrim colonies to change, okay? Let's talk about the health and welfare of people in New England. Now, cold winters suck. We here in Nebraska, we deal with cold winters and hot summers. But one thing that those seasons do is it actually cuts down on the number of microbes, especially the number of microbes that are in the water supply. New Englanders actually were very healthy by comparison to people from England and definitely compared to people from the southern colonies, okay? It's said that people in New England actually invented grandparents, that you could see 3 generations of people alive at the same time. Grandchildren, parents, grandparents, okay? That people in New England were healthy enough to survive into their 60s and 70s, which at the time was pretty remarkable. Another thing that healthier standards, a healthier living standard creates is better infant mortality rates. More children are born and survive the first year of life. More women survive childbirth, okay? And so families are stable. You have a mother and a father that raise children together, and they care about the upbringing of that child because that child is going to survive. So the overall quality of life in New England was very good. But what's the drawback to that? Let's think outside the box here a minute. How might that negatively affect women? Yeah.
They get less rights.
Okay. If the man is alive and stays alive, and a woman never, or women less frequently have to worry about remarrying, well, then they're not going to receive the property rights that women in the South had. They're also going to be kept in a domestic role in the sense that they're going to stay in the house, right? That women, their job is to raise all of these children. And trust me, New Englanders, even though they were uptight religiously, they were very active sexually. These New Englanders would have, 7, 8, 9 children. Rapid population growth. Now, they tried their best to raise those kids. Another important part of the health and welfare of people in New England was that they believed strongly in education. For anybody that comes to school on a regular basis thinking, damn the person who ever came up with school, okay, we have New Englanders to thank for that. Because they were so religiously uptight, they wanted to be sure that their kids could read the Bible. And so New England creates some of the first public schools. Harvard University, okay? Harvard University, first college in North America. So it's the oldest academic institution in the country. Guess what the purpose of Harvard College was? And you should know this from your reading, but let's just rehash it. What was the one profession where you needed academic training in order to perform it? Ministry. Yeah, think about how times have changed. There were really 3 professions that required schooling in the 18th century colonies. Number 1, the most important profession to the Puritans and to college education was ministry. Number 2, to be a teacher of those ministers, so education, needing educators to educate. Number 3 was the law, okay? Because the law and the Bible and ministry went hand in hand, law, ministry, and education, those were your 3 professions. Now, I know some of you are doctors' children. It's kind of funny because in the colonies, doctors were not professionally educated. They were considered tradesmen, like a lumberjack or a blacksmith. Okay, they learned their trade from someone else, and it was just a crude practice, like, guessing, experimentation. A lot of doctors had to practice a side job. For example, Paul Revere, right? Paul Revere, the Midnight Ride guy. He was a metalsmith, but he worked as a dentist on the side. He made George Washington his favorite pair of dentures because you couldn't make money to support yourself enough as a dentist. You had to have a side gig. So, education becomes incredibly important So we have a relatively good lifestyle in New England. We have pictures of mothers and children. We have our first examples of grandparents and older generations surviving into their 70s. This is not at all the way that things are going in the South. Okay. The next big changes that I want to talk about taking place are political. Now let's review really quickly. Who had the power to be a citizen in New England? You had to be a part of the church. Okay, you had to be a part of the Puritan church, which becomes known as the Congregation Church, because the congregation made all of the decisions. Okay, to be a part of the congregation was to be a citizen. And if you remember, in order to be part of the congregation, you had to have a conversion experience. The church was the town hall, right? So compared to the South, New England had more democracy because there were more church members than there were aristocrats. But it was still a pretty small elite group. In fact, the Puritans referred to the church leadership as the elect, not as in they were elected by the members of the congregation, which they were, but they were elect because they were chosen by God as part of the saved, right? So we have a strong community of like-minded people. We're not going to see a whole lot of problems. But ultimately, through more people being born in the colonies and not really knowing their family's old ways, and an influx of immigrants, we start to see pressure on the church. Now, let me talk a little bit about that. Okay? This is a tale as old as time. Immigrant children struggle with their parents and the values of their old customs, right? So these kids who were born in the colonies don't remember the struggles back in England. They don't remember the struggles when the Puritans went to the Netherlands. What they see is all of the diversity, and by diversity, I mean they see people from the Netherlands, they see people from Sweden, they see other colonials who live different walks of life, and they don't feel as connected to the old religion. Because guess what? If you think my lecture is boring, nothing was more boring than a Puritan church service. Okay, for those of you that go to any religious service now, but especially a Protestant church service, you know that the message in a Protestant church service is supposed to move you. It's supposed to be really personal. It's supposed to be emotional. Usually a pastor is really good at speaking. Priests, not as much, right? Priests, the whole focus of the Catholic Church is the actual order of service, the traditions, which are called Mass. But in the Protestant churches, the message is supposed to be meaningful. That was not the way the Congregational Church was. Ministers would get up, they'd lecture, it would be unemotional, it'd be very legalistic. These are God's laws, we must obey. If there was singing, the only thing that the Puritans allowed people to sing were verses from the Bible. So you could sing the Bible, but if you were harmonizing, if you were trying to create music just for vain enjoyment, that was a sin, because you're putting pleasure before God. So church services in Puritan New England were really, really dull. So young people don't want to go to that. Foreigners don't want to go to that. And the membership of the Congregational Church starts to dwindle as we get into the 1700s. Okay? Plus, all of the laws around New England are starting to be old-fashioned, right? We talked about these laws. Remember, the punishments were written on scraps of colored paper. What color was that paper? These laws get their names from the blue laws. Yeah, the fines, the charges, the legal paper that was used for moral crimes was blue. So blue laws regulated people's conduct. Now we're going to talk about the middle colonies down the road, but the Netherlands, the Dutch, had set up colonies in what today is New York. And there was piracy, there was prostitution, there were outlaws and bandits and all kinds of roughnecks in these colonies, but they were all making money and living prosperously. So people are getting tired of being told God is angry with them. God will only bless you if you live this upright and strict lifestyle, right? This is what you guys should be reading right now in the Crucible. This idea that God is basically always frustrated and that your success hinges on his pleasure, right? People weren't allowed to get divorced. Those kind of things start to take a toll on the population. I've already referred to this. Women had very few rights in the colonies, the New England colonies. And so that kind of pressure is going to divide the Congregational church. All right, I need to kind of wrap up here with the discussion of the church. Next week, we will look at the first big religious movement of North America. If you are a person who goes to the Methodist church or the Baptist church or a non-denominational church, right, that isn't a Calvinist church, this is the stepping stone towards those denominations that are not all about predestination, hellfire and brimstone, and a conversion experience. Okay? But the Congregational church is going to try to keep people coming through their doors. Okay? They're going to try to make a deal with the members of the church. For example, in the turn of the 1700s, we have a real big change in the rules of the Congregational church. No longer do you have to have a conversion experience to be a member. Okay? Instead, you can be a member of the Congregational church if your parents were a member. Okay? Membership by birth. This is what's called the halfway covenant. So if your parents were members of the church, you can now be a voting member of the church. And we'll wait for you to have that conversion experience. Because if your parents were a member, you're halfway there. This is the halfway covenant. What's the problem with that? What's the problem with allowing the children of, and I don't mean small children, but I mean people who haven't had the conversion experience, what's the problem with allowing them to vote? What would be the problem with allowing this newer generation who hasn't had a conversion experience the right to vote? Men, right? Women actually become members of the church at a faster rate during this time. But what's going to be the problem? You open the doors for this new generation of people who haven't had a conversion experience to vote.
Isn't it going to get like corrupt? Sort of?
Depends on who you ask. It's certainly going to change things, right? It's going to water it down. You guys are probably more liberal than your parents. Even those of you that are conservative, you probably are a bit more liberal-minded than your folks. That's pretty typical. So we're going to get a whole new wave of young Puritans into the church who don't necessarily agree with the laws of the old way. We're going to get people who are members of the church that don't attend church anymore. They're simply members of the church because their parents went to church. People like John Proctor, right? John Proctor's a farmer. He gets scolded for not attending worship regularly, yet he's a voting member. That's going to create division amongst the congregation. It's going to create division amongst the community, and every division leads to conflict. Okay? This is where the Salem witch trials come in. We start to see these old lights, the old Puritan guard that want strict adherence to the way things always were, battling with new lights, these newer members, people that are less attached to the hardline standard. They want an emotional experience. They don't believe that God is always angry. Some of them don't believe that God has actually made up God's mind about person's salvation. And so we start to see a split. Well, that's one of many reasons people turn on each other in the most notorious incident in New England's history, the Salem witch trials. Take me through that. What were some of the real reasons people called one another witches? Okay, past grudges to save themselves, deflection to blame somebody else. What else?
They just wanted them dead.
Why did they want them dead?
Kind of like there's some vendetta or something that they don't like.
Sorry, I just.
Right.
I'm confused.
So a vendetta, perhaps, but also think about Putnam. One of the people that signs a lot of the accusations are the Putnams, and the Putnams are after land, right? The nurses and the Putnams have adjoining properties, and a witch gives up their rights to property. They lose their property in this theocratic society. So if your neighbor is convicted of witchcraft and dies, that property becomes open for sale, and a lot of people want to take their neighbor's property. But who else? Who's most likely targeted in the witch trials? Women. Women are becoming bigger members of the congregation during this halfway covenant. Okay, women are getting a more powerful voice, and this is partly a backlash against women. Women don't have much power, but they target women. Who else is targeted? Who are the first to be targeted?
Isn't it like old?
The poor, the insane, the troubled, right? We've got Goody Good and Goody How, and these women that live in ditches, the homeless. Right? They use it as a way to try to clean up their community. They use it as a way to try to crack down on changes or people who don't fit the Puritan mold. And ultimately, though, they start hanging members of the church. At first, it's people like John Proctor, a farmer who hasn't been coming to church regularly. But as they get into Francis Nurse, right? When the nurses are executed, and John Proctor helps Mrs. Nurse up onto the platform, this is a woman that had the conversion experience.
Yeah, you're
spoiling it.
Oh, okay. Well, now you'll know what you're reading about, but pay attention.
Nobody saw it coming.
Okay? But the more they execute these prominent members of society, the more people go, hold on. This is not the city on a hill that our ancestors had envisioned. This is a corrupt system of power. The Salem witch trials, today we have mass murders, shopping malls, schools, all over the place where 12 people dead, we would say, well, we got off lucky. There were thousands of people hung as witches in Europe. Why is the Salem witch trial remarkable? Yeah, it is one moment, but it's the moment where we start to see theocracy crumble in New England. Okay? It's going to be another couple decades, but the power of theocracy is going to crumble around this whole catastrophe. Because religion clearly doesn't create a government that's less corrupt. Okay. Questions at all? You guys got to have some questions about New England society, the role of religion. I'm I'm just gonna stop my recording.